The day my grandson stood in front of my late husband's safe with tears in his eyes and begged me not to open it, I thought he was only trying to protect me from old memories. I had trusted that boy since the day he was born. Never, not once, had he ever given me a reason to doubt him. So when he looked me straight in the eyes and whispered, "Grandma, please just leave it closed," I believed he had a good reason. I put the key away. For nearly 3 years, I kept my promise. Until one ordinary afternoon, a locksmith knocked on my front door. What I discovered inside that old safe didn't just change the way I remembered my husband. It changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. My name is Evelyn. I'm 78 years old, and for almost 50 years, there was one object in my house that I never questioned. A small steel safe sitting quietly in the corner of my late husband's study. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't valuable. Most visitors probably never noticed it. But my husband, Richard, always kept the key around his neck. He never hid the safe from me. He simply never opened it in front of anyone. Sometimes I would tease him. "What's in there?" "Gold bars." He would laugh, kiss my forehead, and answer the same way every single time. "Nothing you need to worry about." After a while, I stopped asking. Marriage teaches you something that young people often don't understand. Love isn't built on knowing every secret. Sometimes it's built on respecting the ones you're never invited to discover. Richard was the kindest man I ever knew. We were married for 52 years. He worked as a mechanic. He loved old country songs, black coffee, and watching the birds every morning from our front porch. He wasn't mysterious. He wasn't dishonest. At least, that's what I believed. When cancer took him, the house became painfully quiet. The silence wasn't just the absence of his voice. It was the absence of all the little things that had quietly become part of my life. The sound of his boots near the back door. The smell of engine oil on his jacket. The way he always whistled while making breakfast. Grief has a strange way of filling every room. You stop noticing furniture. You start noticing memories. Our grandson, Daniel, was the one who helped me the most after the funeral. He came every weekend. Sometimes he fixed a leaking faucet. Sometimes he mowed the lawn. Sometimes he simply sat beside me on the porch without saying a word. He reminded me so much of Richard that just seeing him walk across the yard made me smile. I trusted him completely, more than anyone else in the family. One afternoon, about a month after Richard's funeral, I decided it was finally time to organize his study. Everything was exactly where he'd left it. His reading glasses, his favorite chair, his old notebook filled with handwritten measurements from projects he'd finished years earlier. And there, in the corner, the safe. Dust had already started collecting on top of it. I stood there for several minutes just looking at it. For the first time in more than 5 decades, I realized I had absolutely no idea what was inside. I searched through Richard's dresser until I found the small brass key hanging from the same leather cord he had worn around his neck for years. Holding it in my hand felt strangely emotional. It was as if I was holding one final conversation that hadn't happened yet. I walked back toward the study. I knelt beside the safe. The key fit perfectly. Just before I turned it, I heard the front door slam. "Grandma." Daniel's voice echoed through the hallway. A few seconds later, he stopped in the doorway. His eyes immediately fell on the key in my hand. Then they moved to the safe. The color drained from his face so quickly that it frightened me. He took 2 hurried steps toward me. "Grandma," his voice shook. "Please." He swallowed hard before finishing the sentence. "Please don't open it." I had never seen fear in his eyes before. Not like that. And, in that moment, without realizing it, I slowly pulled the key back out of the lock. For the next few seconds, neither of us spoke. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, breathing heavily as if he had run all the way from his truck instead of walking the short path from the driveway. His eyes never left the safe. Not once. It wasn't the expression of someone curious. It wasn't even the expression of someone worried. It was fear. Real fear. The kind that settles deep inside a person long before they find the courage to explain it. I slowly stood up, still holding the small brass key in my hand. "Daniel?" I asked gently. "What is this about?" He opened his mouth. closed it again, ran both hands through his hair before finally forcing himself to smile. It wasn't convincing. I just don't think you're ready. I frowned. Ready for what? He looked around the room as though searching for an answer hidden somewhere among Richard's old books and tools. I don't know what's inside. The sentence came too quickly, too rehearsed. I just know Grandpa never wanted anyone to open it. That surprised me. Your grandfather never told me that. Daniel looked down at the wooden floor. He told me. Those 4 words echoed inside my mind. Richard had trusted Daniel with something he had never mentioned to me. That thought hurt more than I wanted to admit. When? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. A few months before he passed away. I tried to remember those last, difficult months. Richard had become weaker every week. Some afternoons he would ask Daniel to help him organize the garage. Other days they would simply sit together on the porch while I prepared dinner. I had assumed they were talking about baseball, old cars, life. I never imagined those conversations might have included secrets. What exactly did he tell you? Again, silence. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. He only said one thing. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Whatever happens, don't let your grandmother open that safe. The room suddenly felt colder. Not because of the words themselves, but because they didn't sound like Richard. My husband had spent more than 50 years protecting me, not hiding things from me. If there had been something painful inside that safe, wouldn't he have trusted me enough to decide for myself? I walked toward the window and looked across the backyard. The old oak tree Richard had planted when our daughter was born was still standing proudly. For decades, that tree had been a reminder that our family always faced life together. No lies, no hidden lives, no secrets. At least, that was what I had believed. Behind me, Daniel finally spoke again. Grandma, I know this sounds strange, but Grandpa loved you more than anyone. If he wanted that safe to stay closed, there had to be a reason. His voice sounded sincere, almost desperate. I turned back toward him. Did he ever tell you what was inside? Daniel answered so quickly that it caught my attention. No. Too quickly. Not even a second passed before the word left his mouth. Years of raising children and grandchildren had taught me something. People rarely reveal the truth with their words. Most of the time, their timing reveals it first. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, a tiny seed of doubt quietly settled inside my heart. That evening, after Daniel left, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had answered my questions. It wasn't just what he had said. It was everything he hadn't. For 52 years, Richard had been an open book. He wasn't the type of man who locked drawers or hid receipts in coat pockets. If someone called the house, he answered with me sitting right beside him. If he bought something, he showed it to me before he even carried it inside. He believed marriage wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. That was one of the reasons I had fallen in love with him all those years ago. So, why would a man like Richard leave behind a safe that even I wasn't supposed to open? The question refused to leave my mind. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked quietly through the hallway. Old habits never disappear. For years, whenever I couldn't sleep, Richard would already be awake in the kitchen making coffee. I'd find him sitting by the window, reading the newspaper before sunrise. Without thinking, I walked toward the kitchen, expecting to see him there. Instead, only silence greeted me. The coffee pot was cold. His favorite chair was empty. The realization hit me all over again. He was gone. As I stood there, my eyes drifted toward the study. The door was slightly open. Moonlight stretched across the wooden floor, stopping just inches from the old safe. I stared at it for a long moment. The brass key was still in my robe pocket. For a brief second, I considered walking in, unlocking it, and finally ending the mystery. No one could stop me. Not Daniel. Not anyone. It was my husband's safe. Inside my house. Yet my feet refused to move. Richard had earned my trust thousands of times over our life together. If there had been a reason for his silence, didn't I owe him enough respect to believe there was one? The next morning, I decided to do something simpler. Instead of opening the safe, I would try to understand it. I pulled out several dusty boxes from the closet in Richard's study. Inside were old tax returns, faded warranty papers, instruction manuals for tools he no longer owned, and dozens of family photographs. I spent hours sorting everything into neat piles. Late in the afternoon, I found a small leather notebook I didn't remember seeing before. It wasn't a diary. It was more like a planner. Most pages were filled with appointments, oil changes, birthdays, grocery lists, and reminders to call old friends. Nothing unusual, until I reached the final pages. There, written in Richard's careful handwriting, was a single sentence. No date. No explanation. Just one line. If anything ever happens to me, forgive me. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. My hands began to tremble. Forgive me? For what? Richard wasn't a dramatic man. He never wrote things like that. He solved problems instead of talking about them. He apologized immediately whenever he made a mistake. Seeing those 3 words in his handwriting felt completely out of place. I searched the remaining pages, hoping for another clue. There wasn't one. No names. No details. Nothing. Only that sentence. I closed the notebook and leaned back in Richard's old chair. Outside, the wind gently moved the branches of the oak tree. Inside, the house was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I began to wonder whether grief had been hiding something much larger than loss, and whether the safe in the corner wasn't protecting valuables at all, but protecting a truth someone desperately wanted to keep buried. 3 days passed. 3 long, restless days during which I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. I kept telling myself that grief had a way of turning ordinary details into impossible questions. Maybe Richard had written, "Forgive me," after forgetting an anniversary. Maybe it had something to do with his illness. Maybe there was no mystery at all. But every time I walked past the study, my eyes found the safe. And every time they did, I remembered Daniel's face. Not sadness. Not concern. Fear. On the 4th morning, my daughter Susan came by with groceries. She had always worried more than necessary. Ever since Richard passed away, she insisted on checking on me several times a week. She filled my refrigerator, watered flowers that didn't need watering, and reminded me to lock my doors before bedtime. That morning seemed no different, until she noticed the notebook lying on the dining room table. "What's that?" "It's one of your father's old planners." She smiled. "He never threw anything away." I laughed softly. "That's true." She picked it up and flipped through a few pages without much interest. Then she stopped. Her smile disappeared. She looked directly at me. "Mom, where did you find this?" "In the study." "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "I've never seen this notebook before." That surprised me. Neither had I. Susan slowly closed it and placed it back on the table. Her fingers rested on the cover a little longer than seemed natural. "Did you find anything else?" I thought for a moment. Just the safe. The change in her expression was almost impossible to miss. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked toward the hallway leading to Richard's study. Then back at me. "You haven't opened it." It wasn't a question. It sounded more like hope. "No." I almost did. But Daniel asked me not to. She slowly sat down across from me. "What exactly did he say?" I repeated every word as best as I could remember. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked out the kitchen window for several seconds. Finally, she whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "He knew." "What?" She blinked, as if she hadn't meant to speak out loud. "Nothing." "Susan." She forced a smile. "I just mean, your father probably trusted Daniel. That's all." But it wasn't all. A mother knows when her child is hiding something, even if that child is 60 years old. The rest of the afternoon felt strangely uncomfortable. Susan left much earlier than usual. She hugged me tightly before walking to her car, almost too tightly. As I watched her drive away, one thought refused to leave my mind. Daniel wasn't the only one acting strangely. Now my own daughter seemed frightened by that safe. That evening I did something I hadn't done since Richard's funeral. I unlocked the filing cabinet in his study. Richard had always kept every important document there. Insurance papers, property records, tax returns, military records, marriage certificate. Everything was perfectly organized in labeled folders. Everything, except one empty space. Between two folders was a handwritten label. Safe contents. The folder itself was gone. I stood there staring at the empty space for what felt like forever. Someone hadn't just hidden whatever was inside the safe. Someone had removed every written record that explained it. And suddenly, opening the safe no longer felt like satisfying my curiosity. It felt like the only way left to discover the truth. The empty folder stayed on my mind for the rest of the night. I must have opened that filing cabinet 5 different times, hoping I had overlooked something. Each time, the result was the same. Every document Richard had ever considered important was exactly where it belonged. Our marriage certificate, the deed to the house, insurance policies dating back almost 30 years, even receipts for repairs he had made to the roof 15 years earlier. Richard had always believed that if something mattered, it deserved a proper place. He wasn't an organized man by nature. He chose to be organized because he hated causing problems for other people. That was why the missing folder bothered me so much. It hadn't been misplaced. Someone had deliberately removed it. The following morning, I decided not to tell anyone what I had found. Not Susan. Not Daniel. Not yet. Instead, I drove to the only person who had known Richard almost as long as I had. His best friend, Walter. The two of them had met in high school. Together they had rebuilt old cars, gone fishing every spring, and spent countless Saturday mornings drinking coffee in Walter's garage. If Richard had ever shared a secret with anyone, it would have been him. Walter opened the front door before I even reached the porch. His smile faded the moment he saw my face. "Evelyn, is everything all right?" I smiled politely. I just needed someone to talk to. A few minutes later, we were sitting in his kitchen. Nothing had changed in that house for decades. The same old wooden table, the same faded curtains. Even the coffee mugs were the same ones Richard used whenever he visited. For a moment, it almost felt as though my husband would walk through the door at any second. Walter poured us both coffee. "So, what brings you here?" I hesitated. Then I decided to ask directly. "Did Richard ever talk to you about the safe in his study?" Walter froze. Only for a second, but it was enough. His hand tightened around the coffee mug. "The safe." "Yes. I found something strange after his funeral." He looked down into his cup. "I wouldn't know anything about that." It was a calm answer. Too calm. Richard always said Walter was the worst liar he'd ever met. When Walter lies, Richard used to joke, he suddenly becomes the most polite man in the room. As I watched him carefully choosing every word, I realized Richard had been right. I also found a folder missing. Walter slowly raised his eyes. "What folder?" It was labeled Safe Contents. For the first time since I arrived, real concern appeared on his face. Not surprise. Concern. He leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "I hoped you'd never notice." Those words sent a chill through me. "You knew about it?" Walter rubbed his forehead before answering. "I knew the folder existed. Did you take it?" "No." "Then who did?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the living room where an old photograph of him and Richard sat on a shelf. The picture had been taken during a fishing trip nearly 40 years earlier. Both of them were smiling. Both of them looked completely carefree. Walter's voice became almost a whisper. "The last time Richard came here, he asked me to promise something." My heart began beating faster. "What promise?" Walter closed his eyes for a moment. He said, "If anything happens to me, Evelyn will eventually find the safe." I gripped the edge of the table. He knew I would. Walter nodded slowly. But then he told me something I'll never forget. He said, "I just pray she's never alone when that day comes." I stared at Walter in complete silence. Richard hadn't wanted me to avoid the safe forever. He had expected me to open it someday, which meant someone, somewhere, had changed his plan. I drove home with Walter's words echoing in my mind. "I just pray she's never alone when that day comes." Richard hadn't feared the safe. He had feared the moment I would finally open it. There was a difference. A very important difference. For 52 years, I had known exactly how my husband thought. Whenever he fixed something around the house, he always prepared for what might happen next. If he replaced a pipe, he bought an extra one. If he repaired the roof, he kept spare shingles in the garage. He planned ahead because he believed life always found unexpected ways to surprise us. Now I realized. He had planned for this moment, too. Only someone had interrupted those plans. The closer I got home, the more certain I became of one thing. Someone else knew about the safe. Someone besides Richard. Besides Walter. Besides Daniel. And perhaps, besides me. That afternoon, I returned to the study with fresh eyes. Instead of looking at the safe, I began studying the room itself. Richard had spent thousands of hours there. He repaired clocks, read history books, balanced the family's finances. Sometimes he simply sat by the window watching the birds gather beneath the old oak tree. Everything in that room reflected the man I had loved. Except, something felt different. I couldn't explain it. The bookshelf, the desk, the filing cabinet. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. Yet something inside me kept insisting. Something had been moved. I walked slowly around the room, touching books, running my fingers across old picture frames, opening drawers, closing them again. Nothing. Finally, I stopped in front of Richard's desk. For decades, he had always kept one drawer locked. Not because it contained secrets. It held spare keys, house keys, garage keys, padlock keys, even keys to things we no longer owned. After he died, I had emptied that drawer without paying much attention. Now, something caught my eye. There were tiny scratches around the lock. Fresh scratches. Not old ones. The brass around the keyhole had been damaged recently. Someone had struggled to unlock it. I immediately knew those marks hadn't been made by Richard. He treated every tool he owned with care. Even after 50 years, his favorite screwdriver still looked almost new. He would never have forced a lock. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, everything looked perfectly ordinary. Keys neatly arranged inside small envelopes. Labels written in Richard's handwriting. Garage, basement, storage shed, mailbox. Then, one envelope stood out. It was completely blank. No writing. No label. I picked it up. It felt heavier than a single key should. Inside, there wasn't one key. There were two. The familiar brass key to the safe. And another one. Smaller. Older. Made of black iron. I had never seen it before. There was no note explaining what it opened. No label. Nothing. Just two keys placed together as if Richard wanted whoever found one to find the other. I sat down in his chair, turning the black key over in my hand. It wasn't modern. It looked like something that belonged to an old trunk or an antique cabinet. Certainly not anything inside our house. I searched every drawer again, every shelf, every cabinet. Nothing matched it. As I slipped both keys back into the envelope, the telephone rang. The sudden sound made me jump. Hardly anyone called anymore. When I answered, there was silence. I almost thought the call had disconnected. Then an unfamiliar man's voice spoke quietly. Mrs. Collins? Yes. You don't know me, but if your husband left you a safe. He paused. Don't trust anyone who tells you not to open it. Before I could ask a single question, the line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver long after the dial tone returned. Until that moment, I had believed this mystery belonged only to my family. Now, a complete stranger had just proven I was wrong. That night, I locked every door in the house. Not because I believed someone was trying to break in, because for the first time since Richard died, my home no longer felt like the safest place in the world. I kept replaying the phone call over and over in my mind. The man's voice hadn't sounded threatening. If anything, he sounded nervous, almost as if making that call had been dangerous for him. What stayed with me wasn't his warning. It was one particular sentence. You don't know me. He had been right. I didn't. Yet somehow, he knew about the safe. That realization terrified me far more than the mystery itself. How many people knew about that old steel box sitting quietly in Richard's study? How many people had known all these years, while I walked past it every single day without giving it a second thought? Sleep never came. Around 4 in the morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and carried it onto the front porch. Richard used to say that sunrise had a way of making impossible problems look a little smaller. That morning, it didn't. The neighborhood was silent. Only the sound of sprinklers and distant birds filled the air. I looked toward the old oak tree Richard had planted decades earlier. There was something comforting about seeing it still standing there. Storm after storm, winter after winter. It had survived everything. I wondered if Richard had hoped I would do the same. Just after 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Morning, Grandma." "Morning." I was thinking, maybe I could stop by today. "For what?" "I'll help you clean Grandpa's study." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told him I was still going through the room. "I've almost finished," I replied. There was a brief silence. "Oh, that's good." Then he asked the question I had been expecting. "You haven't opened the safe, have you?" I answered carefully. "No." It wasn't exactly a lie. I still hadn't opened it. Daniel let out a long breath. "So that's good." "Good." Not "I'm glad." Not "thank you." Just "good." Something about that choice of words unsettled me. Before hanging up, he insisted on coming anyway. "I'll be there around lunchtime." As soon as the call ended, I made a decision. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I wasn't going to wait for answers anymore. I drove across town to the locksmith whose business had served our community for nearly 40 years. Harold Jenkins. Richard trusted him with every lock we had ever replaced. When I walked into his small workshop, Harold immediately recognized me. "Evelyn." "I'm so sorry about Richard." We talked for a few minutes. Then I placed the brass key on his workbench. "I need your help." He picked it up, turned it over in his hand. His expression changed almost instantly. "I remember this key." "You do?" He nodded slowly. "I made a copy of it." I felt my stomach tighten. "When?" Harold looked toward the ceiling, trying to remember. "Must have been 7. No. 8 years ago." I stared at him. "You made a copy? For who?" Harold answered without hesitation. "For Richard." I let out a quiet breath. That made sense. Richard always believed in having spare keys. Then Harold added something that made my heart stop. But he wasn't alone. I felt every muscle in my body tense. There was another young man with him. I swallowed hard. "Do you remember who?" Harold frowned. "I've been trying. He wasn't your son. He wasn't Daniel. And he definitely wasn't someone I'd ever seen with Richard before." He placed the key back on the counter. "I remember asking if he was family, and Richard answered." Harold paused. "He'll be one day." I couldn't speak. Richard had never said those words about anyone. Not to me. Not to our children. Not even to Daniel. As I stood there trying to understand what I had just heard, the bell above the shop door rang. Someone had just walked in. Harold looked up. The color immediately drained from his face. Very slowly, he whispered only 3 words. "Don't turn around." Every instinct told me to look. When someone whispers, "Don't turn around," the first thing your body wants to do is exactly that. But something in Harold's voice stopped me. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. He knew whoever had just walked into the shop. I kept my eyes fixed on the worn wooden counter, while pretending to study a rack of old keys hanging on the wall. I could hear slow footsteps behind me. Not hurried. Not nervous. Confident. As though the person had every reason to believe they belonged there. Harold suddenly forced a smile. "Good afternoon." His voice sounded completely different now. Brighter. Almost rehearsed. A man's voice answered. "I just came to pick up my order." It was calm. Deep. Probably in his 60s. Nothing about it sounded familiar. I held my breath. The man walked only a few feet away from me. I caught the scent of cedar aftershave. It instantly reminded me of Richard. Not because he wore it, but because his older brother, Thomas, always had. Thomas had passed away years earlier. For one strange moment, Memories rushed through my mind so vividly that I almost forgot where I was. The stranger spoke again. Take your time. I'm in no hurry. Harold nodded politely. I'll be just a minute. Then, without looking directly at me, he quietly slid a small yellow notepad across the counter. His hand covered the page for only a second. When he moved it away, 3 words had been written in blue ink. Leave separately. I understood immediately. Whoever stood behind me, Harold didn't want that person seeing us leave together. My heartbeat became so loud I was certain everyone inside the shop could hear it. Harold disappeared into the back room, pretending to search for something. The stranger remained behind me. Neither of us spoke. After what felt like forever, Harold returned carrying a small cardboard box. Here you go. The man thanked him. Money changed hands. A receipt was folded. The bell above the front door rang once more. Silence. Only then did Harold slowly exhale. You can turn around now. I did. The shop was empty. The man was already gone. Harold immediately walked to the front window and carefully looked outside. Only after watching a dark blue pickup truck drive away did he lock the front door. He turned the sign from open to closed. Then he came back toward me. I owe you an apology. For what? I shouldn't have let you ask those questions today. I stared at him. What just happened? Harold rubbed both hands across his face. I don't know if that man followed you, or if it was just terrible timing. But I wasn't willing to take the chance. I waited. Finally, he spoke. Richard came here twice about that safe. The first time, he wanted duplicate keys. The second time, he wanted something much more important. What? Harold walked behind the counter and unlocked an old metal cabinet. From inside, he removed a thick appointment ledger. Its pages were yellow with age. He carefully turned to an entry dated nearly 8 years earlier. Then he pointed to a line written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. Next to his signature was one instruction. If my wife ever comes asking about the safe, give her the envelope. I looked up so quickly my chair nearly tipped backward. The envelope? Harold nodded. I've kept it all these years. He reached once more into the cabinet. This time, he pulled out a large brown envelope sealed with red wax. Across the front, in Richard's handwriting, were 5 words that made my eyes instantly fill with tears. For Evelyn, when she's ready. ***. For several seconds, I simply stared at the envelope. I didn't touch it. I was afraid that if I did, everything I believed about my marriage would finally change. Harold gently placed it on the counter between us. I promised Richard the first wouldn't give this to anyone else. Not your daughter. Not your grandson. Only you. My fingers slowly reached for it. The paper felt old. Thick. As if it had been waiting patiently for years. The red wax seal was still perfectly intact. Richard had pressed his old pocket watch into the wax before it hardened. I recognized the small circular imprint immediately. He used that same watch to seal Christmas letters when the grandchildren were little. Seeing that familiar mark made my throat tighten. He trusted you that much? I whispered. Harold nodded. He trusted you even more. He told me that one day you'd have questions. And when that day came, he wanted you to hear his voice before you believed anyone else's. Those words stayed with me. Before you believed anyone else's. Richard knew someone might try to tell me a different story. Someone. Not something. Someone. My hands began to tremble. Can I open it now? Harold smiled sadly. It belongs to you. I think it always did. Very carefully, I slipped my fingernail beneath the wax. The seal cracked with a soft snap. For a moment, I closed my eyes. It felt strangely wrong to open something Richard had prepared years before his death. Almost as if I were disturbing one last conversation he had carefully protected. Inside the envelope were 3 things. The first, a handwritten letter. The second, a black and white photograph. The third, a small brass key. Not the safe key. Not the black iron key I had found in Richard's desk. A completely different key. Smaller than both. With a tiny paper tag tied around it. The tag had only 2 handwritten words. Deposit box. I looked at Harold. I don't understand. He slowly shook his head. I've never seen what's inside. The envelope was sealed the day Richard handed it to me. My eyes returned to the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every loop, every carefully written line. Richard. I unfolded the first page. At the very top, he had written only one sentence. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you myself. The tears came instantly. I hadn't cried like that since the funeral. Not loud, not dramatically, just quietly. The kind of tears that arrive when your heart recognizes someone before your mind does. I kept reading. Richard wrote about our first apartment, about the old pickup truck we could barely afford, about the day Susan was born, about the night Daniel came into the world. He filled 2 pages with memories that only the two of us could have shared. Every paragraph reminded me why I had loved him for more than half a century. Then, the tone changed. His handwriting became slightly uneven, almost as though he had paused several times while writing. The next paragraph began with words that made my breathing stop. There is something I have hidden from you for almost 40 years, not because I stopped trusting you, but because I wanted to protect someone who never deserved to carry this burden. I froze. 40 years. Whatever this was, it hadn't started near the end of Richard's life. It had existed through almost our entire marriage. I looked up at Harold. My voice failed me. I don't know if I can keep reading. Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed his hand gently over mine. Then, he quietly said something Richard himself had told him years earlier. If she stops reading, tell her the truth isn't inside the safe. I stared at him. What do you mean? Harold looked toward the sealed envelope, now lying open on the counter. The safe was only meant to lead you here. Everything suddenly shifted. The safe had never been the destination. It had been the first step. And whatever Richard had spent 40 years protecting was waiting somewhere else. I carefully folded Richard's letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Not because I didn't want to know the rest. Because I suddenly understood that I wasn't ready to read it while standing inside a locksmith shop. Those words deserved more than hurried glances between strangers and ringing telephones. They deserved silence. They deserved home. Harold seemed to understand without my saying a word. He gently pushed the envelope back toward me. Take your time. Richard never wanted you to rush. I nodded. Before leaving, I picked up the small brass, key-marked deposit box. The tiny paper tag had yellowed with age. It looked as though it had been tied there decades earlier. Do you know which bank? I asked. Harold shook his head. No. He never told me, but... He paused. I remember him saying something once. What? One day, she'll know where to go. Richard always spoke that way. As if every answer had its proper time. As if forcing the truth before its moment only created more pain. I thanked Harold and placed the envelope carefully inside my handbag. Before opening the shop door, he stopped me one last time. Evelyn. Yes. If anyone asks, don't tell them you have that letter. His voice was calm, but serious. Not yet. I promised I wouldn't. The drive home felt different from every drive since Richard's funeral. For weeks, I had been searching for answers. Now, I carried them. Or at least part of them. Yet instead of feeling relieved, I felt heavier. Richard had written that he had hidden something for almost 40 years. 40 years. That meant whatever had happened. It had existed through birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations, anniversaries, the birth of our children, the birth of our grandson. An entire lifetime had unfolded while that secret quietly remained in the background. When I pulled into my driveway, I immediately noticed something unusual. Daniel's truck. He was already there. I hadn't told him where I was going. I took a slow breath before getting out of the car. He met me halfway up the walkway. Grandma. I've been waiting. His smile looked forced. His eyes immediately drifted toward my handbag. Where were you? I had a few errands. What kind of errands? His question came too quickly. Too naturally. Almost as if he had rehearsed it. I stopped by Harold's locksmith shop. For the first time since I arrived, Daniel completely lost control of his expression. His face turned pale. What? What did Harold say? I answered honestly. We talked about Grandpa. He stared at me for several seconds, long enough that I could almost hear his thoughts racing. Finally, he asked the question I had begun expecting from everyone connected to this mystery. Did he give you anything? I looked directly into my grandson's eyes. For 78 years, I had believed that honesty was always the right choice. Richard and I had built our marriage on it. But Richard himself had just asked me, through Harold, to trust no one.
Not yet.
For the first time in my life, I lied to someone I loved.
No.
Daniel held my gaze for another moment. Then he slowly nodded. Good. That word again. Good. Not I'm glad. Not I'm relieved. Just good. As he turned toward his truck, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A folded piece of paper was sticking out of his jacket pocket. Only a corner was visible, but it was enough. Across the top, in Richard's unmistakable handwriting, I could clearly read 2 words. Daniel only. I stood frozen. Richard hadn't left just one letter. He had left another one. And somehow, my grandson already had it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of Richard's letter. Not because of the safe. Not even because of the mysterious phone call. I couldn't stop thinking about those 2 words. Daniel only. Richard had written to our grandson, which meant everything I had believed over the last few days was incomplete. If Richard had left me one letter, and Daniel another, then he hadn't been hiding the truth. He had been carefully dividing it.
But why?
Just after sunrise, I carried Richard's letter onto the back porch. The morning air was cool. Birds gathered beneath the old oak tree exactly as they had every day for decades. Richard loved this hour. He always said people made better decisions before the world became noisy. I unfolded the letter again. This time, I continued reading. His handwriting seemed calmer than before, almost as though he had finally reached the part he had struggled to write. My love, if you've reached this point, then you already know someone tried to keep you away from the safe. Please don't be angry with them yet. Most of them believed they were protecting you. Some were protecting themselves. You'll only understand the difference after everything is revealed. I read those sentences 3 times. Richard wasn't accusing anyone, not even the people who had hidden things from me. That sounded exactly like him. He had always believed people could make terrible decisions for reasons they believed were good. The next paragraph made my heart ache. I wish I had been brave enough to tell you while I was alive. Every year I planned to. Every anniversary. Every Christmas. Every birthday. I told myself, next year. Eventually, there were no more next years. I lowered the pages for a moment. That sentence felt painfully human. Richard wasn't describing a crime. He was describing regret. Deep regret. When I looked back down, I found another name. Not Daniel. Not Susan. A name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in nearly 35 years. Michael. I frowned. Michael Carter. Richard's closest friend before Walter. The 3 of them had worked together at the old machine factory when we were young. Then one day, Michael simply disappeared from our lives. Richard told everyone he had accepted a job in another state. We sent Christmas cards for 2 years. None were ever answered. Eventually, life moved on. I had never questioned it. Until now. Richard's letter continued. You always believed Michael moved away. That was the story I wanted you to believe. It was easier, safer. But it wasn't true. I stopped breathing. The pages trembled in my hands. For 35 years, the story had been a lie. Richard had lied to me. Not about money. Not about another woman. About a friend. I forced myself to keep reading. Before you judge me, please remember this. Everything I did because one innocent life depended on it. An innocent life. Those 3 words echoed louder than anything else in the letter. Richard had spent 40 years protecting someone. Not himself. Someone else. Who? A child? A witness? A member of our own family? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. A car had stopped in front of my house. I folded the letter immediately. A silver sedan I had never seen before was parked at the curb. An elderly woman slowly stepped out. She looked to be around my age. Elegant. Neatly dressed. She stood beside the car for several seconds, staring at my house with unmistakable emotion. Then our eyes met. She smiled sadly. Not the smile of a stranger. The smile of someone who had finally found a place she had been searching for. Very slowly, she walked toward my porch. When she stopped in front of me, her eyes filled with tears. "My name is Margaret." She paused, struggling to continue. "I've been trying to find you for almost 40 years. Then she looked at the folded letter still resting in my hands. "I see. Richard finally told you about Michael." Margaret stood quietly at the edge of my porch. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. She wasn't impatient. She wasn't trying to convince me of anything. She simply waited, as though she understood that everything I believed about my life had already begun to unravel before she ever arrived. I slowly folded Richard's letter and slipped it back into the envelope. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but I don't believe we've ever met." She nodded.
No.
"You haven't." Richard made sure of that. Those words landed like a stone in my chest. I gestured toward the rocking chair beside mine. "Please, sit down." She thanked me with a small smile. As she lowered herself into the chair, I noticed how nervous she was. She kept twisting the wedding ring on her finger. It reminded me of something I used to do whenever Richard was in the hospital. Some habits are born from worry, others from guilt. After a long silence, I finally asked the question that had been burning inside me. "Who are you?" Margaret looked toward the old oak tree. "I was Michael Carter's wife." My heart skipped a beat. For decades, I had believed Michael had simply moved away. Now his wife was sitting on my porch, looking as though she carried 40 years of unanswered questions. I stopped myself. "You thought he left." She finished the sentence for me. "That's what everyone believed." I nodded slowly. "Richard told us he accepted a job out west." Margaret closed her eyes.
No.
"He never left." The world suddenly felt very still. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "Michael disappeared." I stared at her. "No, he disappeared. One afternoon, he walked out of the factory, and nobody ever saw him again." A cold sensation spread through my arms. Richard had never told me that. Not once. For 35 years, I had believed Michael packed his belongings and started a new life somewhere else. But according to Margaret, he had vanished.
Completely.
Did the police investigate? For years. They questioned everyone. Family, friends, coworkers. They searched rivers, forests, abandoned buildings. They found nothing. She looked directly at me. "Except Richard." "What about Richard?" "He was the last person who admitted seeing Michael alive." I felt my breathing become uneven. Richard, the last person. No wonder the story had changed. No wonder there were letters. No wonder there had been a safe. Margaret continued before I could interrupt. "The police believed Richard. So did I. He told the same story every single time." Michael finished work. They talked in the parking lot. Michael got into his truck and drove away. She paused. "But..." I leaned forward. "Years later, I found something." My hands tightened around the armrests of the chair. "What?" She reached inside her handbag. For a brief moment, I thought she was about to hand me another letter. Instead, she removed an old newspaper clipping folded so many times the edges had almost disappeared. She carefully unfolded it on the small table between us. There was a black and white photograph of Michael smiling beside his pickup truck. Across the top of the article, in bold letters, it read, "Local factory workers still missing after 6 months." I looked closer. Someone had circled a single sentence with blue ink. Asterisk, police continue to believe there is no evidence of foul play. Asterisk. Margaret tapped the sentence gently. They were wrong. I slowly looked back up. "What makes you say that?" Without answering immediately, she opened her purse once more. This time, she removed a faded cassette tape, the kind families used in old portable recorders decades ago. She placed it beside the newspaper. "My husband recorded something the day before he disappeared." I frowned. Of a recording? She nodded. He never told anyone it existed. I didn't find it until after Richard died. My pulse quickened. Have you listened to it? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Only once. And after hearing it, I finally understood why Richard spent the rest of his life trying to protect someone. She gently pushed the cassette across the table toward me. I think it's time you heard it too. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch the cassette.
It looked so ordinary.
A clear plastic shell with faded black labels. The kind Richard and I used to record Christmas mornings when the children were small. Back then, we never imagined those little tapes would outlive the voices they captured. Margaret rested both hands on her purse. I almost threw it away. I looked up. What stopped you? My husband. She smiled sadly. Michael labeled every cassette. This one didn't have a label. I assumed it was blank. She lowered her eyes. It wasn't. I carefully picked it up. A small crack ran across one corner of the plastic case. Someone had listened to it many times. I don't even own a cassette player anymore, I admitted. Margaret nodded. I brought one. She reached into a cloth bag beside her chair and carefully removed a small portable recorder. It looked almost as old as the tape itself. I replaced the batteries this morning. Neither of us spoke after that. She inserted the cassette. The machine clicked softly. For a few seconds, nothing. Only the faint hiss that old tapes always seem to carry.
Then,
A man's voice. Young.
calm.
Immediately familiar. Michael. Testing. A short laugh. I don't even know if this thing is working. More static. If anyone ever hears this. I guess something happened. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. I've heard this voice 1,000 times. She whispered. But hearing it after all these years. She couldn't finish the sentence. The recording continued. I don't know if I'm being paranoid, but something isn't right. There have been strange people asking questions at the factory. They're not police. They're not inspectors. They're looking for something. A long pause followed. Then Michael spoke again. I told Richard everything. My heart skipped. I trust him. More than anyone. If something happens to me, he knows what to do. I slowly looked toward Margaret. She never took her eyes off the recorder. The tape crackled loudly before Michael continued. If you're hearing this, it means I wasn't able to protect. The recording suddenly distorted. A loud burst of static swallowed several words. Margaret reached forward instinctively. Every time. She whispered. It happens in the same place. The static finally faded. Michael's voice returned. Please don't blame Richard. He promised me. He didn't want to, but I made him promise. Another pause. This one longer. I could hear what sounded like a car door closing somewhere nearby. Then footsteps. Michael's breathing changed. Someone had approached him. His voice became much quieter. Someone's here. If this recording survives, tell. Again. Static. Much worse this time. The tape almost sounded damaged. Only fragments remained. Little. Safe. Evelyn.
Don't. Click.
Silence. The cassette had reached its end. Neither Margaret nor I moved. The recorder continued spinning quietly until it stopped by itself. I realized my hands were shaking. Richard hadn't hidden a crime. At least, nothing on that tape suggested he had. He had kept a promise. A promise made by a frightened friend who believed something terrible was about to happen. But one question now seemed larger than all the others. Who was Michael trying to protect? Just then, a familiar engine pulled into my driveway. Daniel. Through the front window, I watched him climb out of his truck. He wasn't alone. A man wearing a dark business suit stepped out of the passenger side. Daniel pointed toward my front door. The stranger nodded. Then both of them began walking toward the house together. Margaret saw them too. The color drained from her face. Before they reached the porch, she whispered words that made my blood run cold. That's him. I stared at her. The man with Daniel? She nodded once, barely able to breathe. I saw him once. The week Michael disappeared. I had never seen fear appear so quickly on someone's face. Margaret wasn't guessing.
She wasn't confused.
The moment she saw the man step out of Daniel's truck, every trace of color disappeared from her cheeks. She gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "You're certain?" I whispered. She never looked away from the window. I'd recognize him anywhere. Even after all these years. My heart pounded inside my chest. The man looked to be in his early 60s. Perfectly pressed navy suit. Silver hair. Calm posture. The kind of person no one would notice in a crowd because he looked so ordinary.
There was nothing threatening about him.
Nothing unusual. And somehow, that made him even more unsettling. Daniel reached the porch first. He smiled the moment he saw me. "Grandma, I hope you don't mind. I brought someone who wants to help." Help. That word no longer sounded comforting. The stranger climbed the last step slowly before extending his hand. "My name is Charles Bennett." His voice was smooth. Professional. "I worked with your husband many years ago." That sentence immediately caught my attention. Richard had never mentioned anyone named Charles Bennett. Not once. I forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry. I don't remember hearing your name." His smile never changed. "That doesn't surprise me." Our paths crossed only briefly. Margaret quietly stood up behind me. The instant Charles saw her, his expression changed. Only for a fraction of a second.
But I saw it.
Recognition. He knew exactly who she was. "So," Charles said carefully, "we've finally met again." Margaret didn't offer her hand, didn't smile, didn't even blink. I hoped that day would never come. Daniel looked back and forth between them, clearly confused. "You two know each other?" Neither of them answered. The silence itself became the answer. Charles finally looked at me. "Mrs. Collins, I understand you've been asking questions about Richard." There was something unsettling about the way he spoke Richard's name. Too familiar. Too careful. "I've been trying to understand a few things." He nodded sympathetically. "Grief often makes us search for answers. But sometimes, the past is kinder when we leave it alone." I almost laughed. Just a week earlier, Daniel had begged me not to open the safe. Now another stranger wanted me to stop asking questions. Everyone seemed desperate for me to leave the past untouched, which only convinced me that I was getting closer to the truth. Charles reached into his leather briefcase. Very slowly, he removed a thick manila folder. "I brought something that might help." He placed it on the kitchen table. Across the tab, in bold black letters, were 3 words. "Michael Carter Investigation." I stared at the folder. "So you knew Michael?" Charles nodded. "I knew the investigation. I was assigned to review it." Margaret immediately interrupted. "That's not true." Charles remained perfectly calm. "I expected you to say that." Her voice grew sharper. "You weren't investigating. You were covering something up." Daniel looked completely lost. "Grandma, what's happening?" I looked at my grandson. The confusion on his face appeared genuine. If he was pretending, he was doing a remarkable job. Charles slowly opened the folder. Inside were dozens of yellowed police reports, photographs, witness statements, maps. Every page looked authentic. He slid one photograph across the table toward me. "This," he said quietly, "was taken 2 hours before Michael disappeared." I picked it up. There, standing beside Michael, was Richard. The 2 men were talking in the factory parking lot. Nothing unusual, until I noticed the third person, a younger man standing several feet behind them, watching. His face was partially turned away from the camera, but not enough. I felt my stomach tighten. Even through the grainy black and white photograph, I recognized him immediately. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same expression. It wasn't Charles. It wasn't Walter. It wasn't Daniel. It was the man who had walked into Harold's locksmith shop, only 40 years younger. Without taking my eyes off the photograph, I quietly asked one question. "Who took this picture?" Charles didn't answer. Margaret did. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "That's the one question no one has ever been able to answer." No one spoke. The old photograph remained on the kitchen table between us. It had suddenly become the center of everything. Richard, Michael, and an unidentified young man watching them from a distance. 40 years earlier, that face had meant nothing. Today, it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. Charles carefully pulled the photograph back toward himself. You noticed him. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Who is he? Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a pair of reading glasses from his pocket and slowly cleaned the lenses with a handkerchief. He was buying time. People often do that when they're deciding how much of the truth to reveal. Finally, he looked at me. His name was Anthony Brooks. I asked. Charles nodded. He died 12 years ago. Margaret immediately leaned forward. That's impossible. Charles looked at her calmly. It isn't. You've been looking for the wrong man all these years. She shook her head.
No.
I saw him. Charles sighed. You saw Anthony. But Anthony wasn't the person you should have been searching for. Daniel remained completely silent. His eyes moved from Charles to Margaret.
To me.
Then finally to Richard's old letter still lying on the table. He looked overwhelmed, almost frightened. I suddenly remembered the envelope sticking out of his jacket 2 days earlier. The one marked, Daniel only. Daniel. He looked at me. I need you to answer something honestly. I will. Did Grandpa leave you a letter? His expression changed instantly. Not because he had been caught, because he realized I already knew. After several long seconds, he nodded. Yes. The room became perfectly still. Margaret quietly closed her eyes. Charles lowered his head. Neither of them looked surprised. Richard had planned this. He had left different pieces of the truth
To different people.
When did you receive it? The day after the funeral. Did you read it? Daniel swallowed. Not all of it. Why not? His voice became almost embarrassed. Because Grandpa wrote one sentence on the first page. What sentence? Daniel slowly looked at me. He said, Don't continue reading until your grandmother finds my letter. I felt my eyes fill with tears. Richard hadn't wanted secrets between us. He had wanted us to discover the truth. Together. All this time, Daniel hadn't been trying to hide the letter from me. He had been waiting exactly as Richard had instructed. My heart sank. I remembered every suspicious look, every doubt, every lie I had told him. Perhaps I had misunderstood him from the very beginning. Daniel reached into his jacket. Very carefully, he removed the envelope. It looked almost identical to mine. The same cream-colored paper, the same dark blue handwriting. Only the words across the front were different. For Daniel, open only after Evelyn finds hers. Asterisk, asterisk. He placed it beside Richard's letter. Without saying a word, he opened it. Inside was a single folded page. Unlike my letter, this one was much shorter. Daniel quietly began reading aloud. If you're reading this, your grandmother already knows enough to begin asking the right questions. I chose you because I knew you would protect her, even if she became angry with you. Daniel's voice broke.
He looked at me.
I'm sorry, Grandma. I wasn't trying to keep anything from you. I was trying to do exactly what Grandpa asked. I reached across the table and took his hand. For the first time since this mystery began, I believed him.
Completely.
Then Daniel continued reading. The safe contains nothing that explains the past. It only contains proof that the future must not repeat it. I frowned. Proof? Not documents. Not money.
Proof.
Richard had chosen that word very carefully. Daniel turned to the final paragraph. As he read the last sentence, every person in the room fell silent. Because Richard had written something none of us expected. If Michael's daughter is standing beside Evelyn, tell her, I've kept my promise. I slowly turned toward Margaret. She was already crying. Not quietly anymore. She covered her mouth with both hands. I could barely breathe. Michael's daughter? I looked at her in complete disbelief. You told me. You were his wife. Margaret shook her head through tears. No. I told you. I was Michael Carter's family. I never said I was his wife. She took a trembling breath. Then, for the first time in 40 years, she spoke the truth. I'm his daughter. No one in the room moved. The only sound was the old grandfather clock in the hallway.
Tick, tick, tick.
I looked at Margaret, searching her face for some sign that I had misunderstood. You?
My voice barely came out.
You're Michael's daughter? She slowly nodded. I've always been Michael's daughter. I just stopped telling people. I couldn't understand. But why? She wiped her eyes before answering. Because every time I said my father's name, people looked at me differently. They didn't see a little girl. They saw the daughter of a missing man. She smiled sadly. I got tired of answering questions no one could answer. Daniel looked completely stunned. He glanced at Richard's letter, then back at Margaret. So, Grandpa knew you? Margaret nodded. He knew me better than almost anyone. The room fell silent again. I thought back to every Christmas dinner, every birthday party, every family gathering. Never, not once, had Richard mentioned a little girl named Margaret. Yet somehow, he had protected her for 40 years. How old were you? 7. Her answer broke my heart. I was 7 years old when my father disappeared. I remember standing at the living room window every evening. I believed he would come home. For months. I refused to sleep until my mother closed the curtains. Because I didn't want him to think we'd stopped waiting. She looked down at her hands. Children don't understand disappearance. They only understand absence. No one interrupted her. Even Charles lowered his head. My mother eventually stopped talking about him. Not because she forgot, because remembering hurt too much. She took a slow breath. But Richard never forgot. My eyes filled with tears again. What did he do? Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving. A few months after my father's disappearance, a man knocked on our door. He brought groceries, fixed a broken window, repaired the leaking roof. My mother thought he was simply being kind. She looked directly at me. It was Richard. I closed my eyes. Of course it was. That was exactly the kind of man he was. If someone needed help, he never waited to be asked. He came every few weeks. Sometimes he brought food. Sometimes books. When I turned 16, he helped me pay for college. I stared at her in disbelief. Richard had paid for her education without ever mentioning it. He told me one thing every single time. She smiled through her tears. The world may never know what happened to your father, but don't let that stop you from building your future. That sounded exactly like Richard. Always looking forward, always trying to protect hope. Charles quietly cleared his throat. I'm afraid that's only part of the story. Margaret's smile disappeared. I know. Charles slowly opened the investigation folder again. This case wasn't only about Michael. It never was. He removed another photograph. This one was in color. Newer. Taken perhaps 15 years after Michael disappeared. The picture showed Richard standing beside a teenage girl, Margaret. Both of them were smiling outside what looked like a college campus. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single sentence. Promise kept. I felt tears running freely down my face. Richard hadn't spent 40 years hiding guilt. He had spent 40 years honoring a promise. A promise to a dying friend. Or perhaps to a frightened father. But one question still remained. The biggest one of all. If Richard was protecting Margaret, I looked at Charles. Then, who was he protecting her from? Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly reached into the investigation file and removed one final document. Unlike everything else, this page had been sealed inside a clear plastic evidence sleeve. Across the top, in faded typewriter letters, were 6 words. Confidential. Never released to the public. Charles placed it carefully on the table. Then he quietly said the words none of us were prepared to hear. Because Michael was never the intended victim. The words hung in the air long after Charles finished speaking. Michael was never the intended victim. I felt as though the room had suddenly become too small. Every answer we uncovered only seemed to reveal an even larger question. Margaret slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Her lips trembled. For 40 years, I believed someone wanted my father. Charles looked at her with genuine sadness. So, did almost everyone. He carefully slid the evidence sleeve toward me. Inside was a faded interview transcript. The paper had yellowed with age, but the typewritten words were still readable. At the top was the date, October 14th, 1984, the day before Michael disappeared. Charles pointed to a paragraph highlighted in blue. This interview was never released. I adjusted my glasses and began reading. The witness described seeing two men arguing in the factory parking lot. One was identified as Michael Carter. The other was never identified. According to the witness, the unidentified man kept repeating the same sentence. "You've got the wrong person." I looked up. The wrong person? Charles nodded. The witness repeated that sentence 3 separate times. Margaret leaned forward. "So my father wasn't the one they wanted?"
No.
Charles answered quietly. He simply happened to be standing where someone else was expected to be. A chill ran down my spine. Richard's letter, the safe, the hidden documents, the promise. Everything suddenly began fitting together. Very slowly, very painfully. Who, I whispered, was the real target? Charles looked directly at me. "I believe." He paused. "It was Richard." The room fell silent. Completely silent. I couldn't even hear the grandfather clock anymore. Only my own heartbeat. Richard, my gentle, quiet husband, the man who spent weekends fixing bicycles for neighborhood children, the man who cried the day our first granddaughter was born. Why would anyone want to hurt him? Margaret looked just as confused. My father never mentioned enemies. Charles nodded. Neither did Richard. But they had discovered something. What? Charles reached into the folder again. This time he unfolded a large map of the old machine factory. It no longer existed. The buildings had been demolished decades earlier. Several areas were circled in red. One building, in particular, Warehouse 4. What happened there? Charles took a slow breath. Officially, it stored machine parts. And unofficially, he looked at each of us before answering. It stored records. What kind of records? He hesitated. The kind powerful people didn't want anyone to find. My stomach tightened. Richard had never liked talking about his years at the factory. Whenever someone asked, he'd simply smile and say, "It was just a job."
Wait.
It had never been just a job. Charles continued. A shipment disappeared. Then paperwork disappeared. Then one employee disappeared. Margaret whispered the next words almost to herself. "My father." Charles nodded. And after Michael vanished, Richard became the only person left who knew where certain records had been hidden. I suddenly remembered something from Richard's letter. I did it to protect one innocent life. Not my life. Not our family. One innocent life. Margaret. Richard hadn't spent 40 years hiding from danger. He had spent 40 years making sure danger never reached Michael's daughter. Charles quietly folded the map. The people involved are gone now. Most have passed away. The investigation was quietly closed years ago. I looked toward Richard's study, toward the old safe waiting silently in the corner. "So," I asked, "what was inside the safe?" Charles smiled gently. "I don't know. But after everything you've learned today, I'm beginning to think Richard never cared whether anyone opened it." He looked toward the hallway. "I think he only wanted to make sure you were finally ready for what came after." For the first time since this journey began,
I realized something.
the safe had never been the mystery. The mystery had always been Richard's heart. That evening, after Charles and Margaret left, I sat alone in Richard's study. For the first time since his funeral, I wasn't staring at the safe. I was staring at his chair. The chair where he had spent thousands of quiet evenings reading newspapers, repairing old watches, and writing birthday cards to our grandchildren. How many times had I walked past that room believing I knew everything about the man sitting there? The answer hurt, not because Richard had lied to me, because I had finally understood how heavy some promises can become. I thought back to something he used to tell Daniel whenever they worked together in the garage. A good man isn't measured by the secrets he keeps, but by who he protects with them. Back then, I thought he was talking about confidence, about loyalty between friends. Now I wondered if he had been quietly describing his own life. The envelope still rested on his desk. Beside it lay the 3 keys. The brass key to the safe, the black iron key from the unlabeled envelope, and the tiny key marked deposit box. 3 keys, 3 doors, 3 pieces of the same story. I reached for Richard's letter once more. There were still 2 pages I hadn't read. Slowly, I unfolded them. His handwriting looked slightly less steady than before. My love, if you've made it this far, you've probably met people I hoped you would never have to meet. Please don't hate them. Most of them have carried this burden almost as long as I have. I stopped. Richard wasn't asking me to forgive himself. He was asking me to forgive everyone else. That was exactly the man I married, always thinking about other people's peace before his own. I continued reading. There were many nights when I almost woke you to tell you everything. I would look at you sleeping beside me, then remember a frightened little girl who had already lost her father. Every time I had to choose, I chose her future. Tears blurred the words. I realized then that I had never truly been competing with another secret. I had been sharing my husband with a promise made to a dying friend, or perhaps to a desperate father. Either way, it had never been about betrayal. It had always been about protection. The next paragraph contained something entirely unexpected. I know you'll eventually find the small black key. You won't recognize it. Neither did I, at first. I instinctively looked toward the black iron key lying on the desk. Richard continued, "It doesn't belong to our house. It belongs to the only place I ever truly feared." A cold sensation spread through my chest. The factory. Warehouse 4. My eyes moved quickly across the page. The building is gone now, but not everything beneath it. Beneath it? I frowned. Richard had underlined those 2 words. Beneath it. I read the sentence again, then a 3rd time. Suddenly, the black key no longer seemed connected to furniture, or trunks, or cabinets. It belonged somewhere underground. A storage room? A maintenance tunnel? A forgotten vault? Before I could think any further, someone knocked gently on the front door. At first, I assumed it was Daniel. He often stopped by after dinner. But when I opened the door, no one was there. Only a small cardboard package sitting neatly on the welcome mat. No return address. No shipping label. Just my name, written in careful handwriting. Evelyn Collins. I carried it inside. It wasn't heavy. Inside, there was only one item. An old brass compass, wrapped in newspaper from 1984. Attached to it, a handwritten note. Only one sentence. Richard always knew you would find the right direction. There was no signature. Only a tiny symbol drawn at the bottom of the page. A simple oak leaf. Exactly like the one Richard used to carve into every wooden project he ever made. I held the compass in my hands for several minutes. It was heavier than it looked. Its brass casing was scratched from years of use, and the glass covering the needle had a small crack running across one side. When I gently turned it over, my breath caught. Engraved into the back were 2 initials. R.C. Richard Collins. This hadn't belonged to a stranger. It had belonged to my husband. I slowly ran my thumb across the worn engraving. Richard had carried this compass. Perhaps in his pocket. Perhaps in his toolbox. Perhaps during the years when he quietly carried a promise that even I knew nothing about. The note lying beside it kept drawing my attention. Richard always knew you would find the right direction. Who had sent it? Walter? Harold? Charles? Margaret? None of it felt right. If any of them wanted to speak to me, they would simply knock on the door. Why remain anonymous? Then there was the symbol, the oak leaf. Richard carved that tiny leaf into almost everything he built. The bookshelf in our living room, the wooden cradle he made for Daniel, even the birdhouse hanging beneath the old oak tree outside. Very few people knew about it. It wasn't a signature. It was simply a habit, something he did without thinking, which meant whoever sent the package knew Richard very well. The next morning, I called Walter. I need to ask you something. Of course. Did Richard own a compass? There was silence, long enough that I wondered whether the call had dropped. Finally, Walter answered. I was hoping you'd never find that. Another person. Another sentence that began with hope. Hope you never opened the safe. Hope you never noticed the folder. Hope you never found the compass. It seemed everyone around Richard had spent years hoping I would never follow the trail he had carefully left behind. Can you come over? Walter arrived within half an hour. The moment he saw the compass resting on my dining table, his shoulders sank. I haven't seen this in decades. You recognize it? He smiled faintly. I bought it. I looked up. You did. It was Richard's birthday. 1983. We went fishing together. I wanted to give him something he'd actually use instead of another coffee mug. For the first time in days, Walter laughed. A compass seemed practical. His smile faded just as quickly. I had no idea what it would eventually mean. What do you mean? Walter picked up the compass carefully. He didn't open it. Instead, he gently pressed his thumb against the outer rim.
Click.
A tiny compartment hidden inside the brass casing sprang open. I stared in disbelief. I never knew. Walter nodded. Neither did I. Until Richard showed me. Inside the secret compartment was a tightly folded strip of paper.
So small it could barely fit.
Walter handed it to me. You should open it. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't even a sentence. It was a hand-drawn map. Simple.
Rough. Almost childlike.
An outline of the old factory grounds. A large X had been drawn beneath Warehouse 4. Below the map, Richard had written 4 words. Only if she's safe. I looked at Walter. What does that mean? His eyes filled with tears. It means Richard never wanted anyone looking beneath that warehouse. Unless he was absolutely certain Margaret could never be hurt because of it. I stared at the map again. Warehouse 4 no longer existed. The building had been demolished nearly 20 years earlier. Everything above ground was gone. But Richard hadn't marked the building. He had marked what was underneath it. Just then my cell phone buzzed. It was a text message from Daniel. Only 6 words. Grandma, someone broke into Grandpa's study. My heart stopped. I looked toward the hallway. The study door was still closed. Then I realized Daniel wasn't texting from my house. He was texting from the storage unit where we'd moved several of Richard's old workshop cabinets after the funeral. Someone wasn't searching the house anymore. Someone had started looking where Richard's things had been taken. I was already reaching for my car keys before I finished reading Daniel's message. Grandpa, someone broke into Grandpa's study.
No.
Not the study. The storage unit. The place where we had taken several of Richard's old workshop cabinets after his funeral because there wasn't enough room in the house. I immediately called Daniel. He answered on the first ring. Grandma.
His voice was shaking.
Are you all right? Yes. But you need to come. What happened? I came to organize Grandpa's tool cabinets. When I unlocked the storage unit, everything was on the floor. My grip tightened around the steering wheel. Did they steal anything? He hesitated. I don't think so. What do you mean? It doesn't look like someone came to steal. It looks like someone came to search. Those words made my heart race. Not steal.
Search.
Exactly like Richard's study. Exactly like the missing folder. Exactly like the scratches around the locked drawer. Someone wasn't interested in valuables. Someone was looking for something very specific. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The storage facility sat on the edge of town beside an old railroad line. Richard had rented the unit years earlier whenever he needed extra space for restoration projects. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw 2 police cars. Daniel stood outside the open unit with Officer Reynolds, a man I'd known for nearly 20 years. He removed his hat respectfully as I approached. Mrs. Collins, I'm sorry you had to see this. I stepped inside. The sight stopped me cold. Metal cabinets had been emptied. Drawers lay upside down across the concrete floor. Old photographs, boxes of screws, rusted tools, family albums. Everything had been pulled apart. Whoever had done this wasn't careless. They were methodical. Every box had been opened. Every envelope unfolded. Every shelf examined. Officer Reynolds pointed toward the back wall. They even removed the panels. I looked. Several sheets of plywood had been unscrewed and left leaning against the wall. Whoever searched this place believed something had been hidden inside it. Any fingerprints?
He sighed.
Almost none. They wore gloves. Professional.
Prepared.
Deliberate. Daniel walked over carrying a small wooden box. I found this under Grandpa's old workbench. The box was covered in dust. Far more dust than everything else. Whoever had searched the unit had missed it. It wasn't locked, only tied shut with faded leather straps. I slowly untied them.
Inside.
There wasn't money, or jewelry, or documents. Only dozens of small wooden carvings.
Birds. Leaves.
Tiny houses. Pocket crosses. Little toys. Every one of them beautifully made. Richard had carved them over the years. I smiled through tears. I remember these. He used to make one every Christmas. Daniel nodded. I almost threw the box away. Then something caught my eye. Beneath the carvings was a false wooden bottom. I carefully lifted it. Hidden underneath was a single cassette tape. Unlike Michael's cassette, this one had a handwritten label. Richard, 1985. For Evelyn. I stopped breathing. Another recording. Made almost 40 years ago. Officer Reynolds looked at me. Do you know what it is? I couldn't answer. My throat had closed. Richard had made a recording for me. Not after he became sick. Not near the end of his life. In 1985. Only months after Michael disappeared. Why had he hidden it here? And why hadn't he ever told me it existed? Daniel gently touched my shoulder. Grandma. I looked at him. I think Grandpa knew that someday someone would search the house. He glanced around the destroyed storage unit. But they never knew about this box. I carefully held the cassette in both hands. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what Richard had left behind. I was afraid of what someone else had been trying so desperately to erase. Because if people were still searching, after 40 years, then whatever Richard had protected still mattered today. No one spoke on the drive back to my house. The cassette rested on my lap the entire time. I held it so carefully that it almost felt alive. Richard had recorded my name on that label nearly 40 years earlier. Not family. Not important. Not private. Just for Evelyn. He had never intended anyone else to hear it. When we arrived, Daniel carried an old cassette player from the attic. It was the same one we used every Christmas when the grandchildren were little. For years it had collected dust inside a cardboard box labeled Holiday Decorations. I smiled through my tears. Richard never threw anything away. For the first time, I was grateful for that habit. Daniel carefully cleaned the tape heads with a cotton swab while I placed the cassette on the dining room table. Neither of us rushed. It felt almost sacred, as though opening it required the same respect as opening one of Richard's letters. When everything was ready,
Daniel looked at me.
Are you sure? I nodded. I've waited long enough. He pressed play. For several seconds, only the familiar hiss of old magnetic tape filled the room. Then, Richard laughed softly. Not a nervous laugh. The warm laugh I had heard thousands of times across 52 years of marriage. My dear Evelyn, if you're listening to this, then I wasn't able to keep my promise. The tears came instantly. Just hearing his voice again felt impossible. I reached for Daniel's hand without even realizing it. Richard continued. I wanted to tell you everything myself. I truly did. But if life had other plans, then at least you'll hear this in my own words. There was a brief pause. I could hear birds singing somewhere in the background. He must have recorded it outside, probably beneath our oak tree. I know you'll have questions. And I know your first thought will be, why didn't you trust me? Another pause. Then came the answer. I trusted you more than anyone. That's exactly why I stayed silent. I closed my eyes. Those words removed a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Richard hadn't hidden the truth because he doubted me. He had hidden it because he believed telling me would place me in danger. The recording continued. There are moments in life when telling the truth too early only gives evil another chance. I prayed that one day the world would become quiet enough for the truth to be safe. Quiet enough, not forgotten. Safe. Richard always chose his words carefully. Then his voice became noticeably softer. There's one thing I need you to understand. I never protected a secret. I protected a child, Margaret. Even before he said her name, I knew. I promised Michael that if anything happened to him, his little girl would never grow up believing she had been abandoned. Daniel quietly wiped away his eyes. Richard continued. I couldn't bring her father home, but I could make sure she had hope. I looked toward the old family photographs hanging in the hallway. For decades, while I believed Richard was simply working late or helping friends, he had quietly been helping a little girl rebuild her life. Not because anyone asked him, because he believed it was the right thing to do. Then, the recording changed. Richard took a deeper breath. If you've already found the black key, then there's only one thing left. My heart immediately began racing. The safe never mattered. The letters never mattered. Even this recording doesn't matter. I frowned. What could possibly matter more? Richard answered. The only thing that matters is whether our family chooses kindness after learning the truth. Silence followed, long enough that I thought the recording had ended.
Then,
his final message. My greatest fear was never that you would discover my secret. My greatest fear was that it would change the way you remembered me. His voice almost disappeared into the tape. So, before you open the final door, please remember one thing. I loved you. Every single day.
click.
The tape stopped. No dramatic ending. No final revelation. Just silence. The kind of silence that only follows a lifetime of love. Daniel reached over and stopped the recorder. Neither of us moved. Finally, after several minutes, he quietly asked, What do we do now? I looked at the 3 keys resting beside Richard's letter, then at the small hand-drawn map hidden inside the compass. For the first time, I knew exactly what Richard had wanted all along. The next chapter wasn't about discovering another secret. It was about honoring the last promise he had ever made. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't chasing answers. I was carrying responsibility. Richard hadn't spent 40 years asking people to protect a secret. He had spent 40 years asking them to protect one another. There was a difference, a profound difference. I placed everything on the dining room table one last time. His letters, the cassette, the hidden map, the 3 keys, the old compass, and the photograph of him standing beside Michael. For days, I had looked at these objects as pieces of a mystery. Now, I saw them for what they truly were, pieces of a man's character. Richard had never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He would have hated that word. He believed ordinary people should simply do what was right when the moment arrived. No applause, no recognition, just kindness. At 10 o'clock, Daniel arrived with Margaret. A few minutes later, Walter joined us. Then Harold. Finally, Charles. The 6 of us sat around the same dining room table where Richard had carved Thanksgiving turkeys, wrapped Christmas presents, and taught Daniel how to play checkers. So, it felt as though he was sitting there with us. No one spoke first. Eventually, I broke the silence. I've made a decision. 5 pairs of eyes looked toward me. I'm not opening anything else. Daniel frowned. The deposit box? I nodded. The underground room. The black key. The map. All of it. Margaret looked surprised. But, don't you want to know? I smiled gently. I already do. She looked confused. So do I. Richard had answered the only question that truly mattered. Not what happened. Not who was responsible. Not what had been hidden beneath Warehouse 4. The only question that had kept me awake every night since his funeral was much simpler. Had I really known my husband? Now, I finally had my answer. Yes. Better than ever. He hadn't been living a double life. He had been living a quiet one. The kind of life that never makes headlines. The kind built on promises no one else ever notices. Charles leaned forward. You understand, those records may never be found. I nodded. Maybe that's exactly how Richard wanted it. Walter smiled through watery eyes. That sounds like him. Harold laughed softly. He used to tell me, sometimes justice isn't about proving what happened. Sometimes it's about making sure it never happens again. Margaret quietly reached into her purse. She removed the photograph of Michael, then placed it beside one of Richard. For the first time, the two friends were together again, separated only by a lifetime of silence. I spent 40 years angry, she whispered, at the police, at the town, at whoever took my father away. She looked at Richard's photograph. I never stopped to thank the man who stayed. No one had anything to add. Nothing could improve those words. That afternoon, the six of us drove to the small cemetery where Richard rested beneath an old maple tree. Margaret carried a single white rose. Daniel carried the compass. I carried Richard's letters. We stood there quietly. No speeches. No dramatic confessions. Only gratitude. Margaret knelt beside the headstone. She gently placed the rose against the polished granite. Then she whispered something only Richard could hear. Promise kept. A light breeze moved through the trees. The same way it always had. The same way Richard used to smile whenever the wind carried leaves across our backyard. As we turned to leave, Daniel slipped his hand into mine. Grandma, I finally understand, Grandpa. I squeezed his hand. So, do I. And somehow, that felt like the ending Richard had been waiting for all along. Life has a quiet way of moving forward. Not all at once. Not in dramatic moments. But one ordinary morning at a time. The weeks that followed felt different. The house was still quiet. Richard's chair still sat beside the window. His coffee mug still rested on the kitchen shelf where I couldn't bring myself to move it. But something inside me had changed. The weight I had been carrying since his funeral was finally gone. Not because every question had been answered, because I had stopped believing every mystery needed one. Daniel continued visiting every weekend. Only now, he no longer came because he thought I needed protecting. He came because we had both learned the same lesson from Richard. Family isn't built by the secrets we inherit. It's built by the love we choose to pass forward. Margaret became part of our lives almost naturally. At first, she would stop by only for coffee, then Sunday dinners. Eventually, she no longer felt like a visitor. She felt like family. One afternoon, several months later, she stood beneath the old oak tree with me. The same tree Richard had planted decades earlier. I used to wonder why he always insisted we meet here. She smiled. I think I finally understand. I looked up at the branches swaying gently above us. So do I. Richard had planted that tree the year Susan was born. He often said he hoped his grandchildren would someday sit beneath its shade. What he never told me was that he hoped another little girl would too. A little girl who had lost her father. A little girl he quietly refused to let life forget. That realization may have been the greatest gift he ever left behind. Months later, I received one final letter. Not from Richard, from Charles. Inside was only a single page. The official investigation into Michael Carter's disappearance had finally been closed. Not solved. Closed. Most of the people involved were gone. Most of the records had disappeared decades earlier. The truth, at least in the eyes of the law, would probably never be complete. I folded the letter, placed it inside Richard's old envelope, and quietly returned both to the safe. Not because I wanted to hide them, because that was where Richard had always intended them to rest. One rainy afternoon, Daniel asked me a question. Grandma, if Grandpa had one chance to do it all again, do you think he'd make different choices? I thought about that for a long time. Then I smiled. I think he would finally tell me everything. Daniel nodded. So do I. But I continued. I also think he'd still keep the same promise. Because that's who Richard was. Not a perfect man. Not a famous man. Not a man remembered by history books. Just an ordinary husband, who quietly chose compassion when no one was watching. As I grow older, I've learned something I wish I had understood years ago. Some people leave behind money. Others leave behind houses. Some leave photographs. Others leave stories. Richard left something far more valuable. He left proof that one act of kindness, repeated faithfully over a lifetime, can become someone else's future. And perhaps that's why I no longer think about the safe, or the missing files, or the secrets. When I think about my husband now, I remember the way he smiled while watering the flowers, the way he whistled before breakfast, the way he held my hand every Sunday at church, and the quiet promise he carried without ever asking for recognition. In the end, the greatest thing I found inside Richard's safe wasn't a document. It wasn't money. It wasn't evidence. It was the truth about the man I had loved for 52 years. Sometimes, the most extraordinary lives are lived so quietly that only after they're gone do we finally understand how extraordinary they truly were. Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. If it touched your heart, I'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel and join me for another story soon. Until next time, take care of the people you love, because the promises we keep in silence may one day become the greatest legacy we leave behind.